The limp was barely noticeable. That's what Dr. Caldwell told himself as he watched Nurse Laura Bennett move through the pre-dawn corridors of Sacred Heart Hospital in Philadelphia, her left leg favoring itself just slightly as she pushed the medication cart past the dimly lit patient rooms. He didn't see the way her hands moved. Didn't see the precision. He didn't know that those hands had held lives together on concrete floors under mortar fire, that they could place a 14-gauge angiocath in absolute darkness, that muscle memory could survive 3 years of trying to forget. He didn't see the single dog tag on a broken chain she kept tucked beneath her scrubs, the metal cool against her collarbone, the name on it worn smooth from 20 years of touch. All he saw was a nurse. Just competent enough to be useful. Quiet enough to ignore. Wrong enough about his authority to be dangerous. Laura's shift at Sacred Heart began the same way it had begun for 1,127 days, quietly. She arrived at 5:19 a.m. on a Tuesday in March, her scrubs still bearing the hospital's logo and the faint smell of industrial laundry detergent that never quite washed out. The corridors hummed with the ventilators of sleeping patients and the soft beeping of monitors in their vigil. Her badge clattered softly against her ribs as she moved, the sound both familiar and comforting, a rhythm she could navigate by even in her sleep. The overnight shift was ending. The day shift was stirring. In that liminal space between one world and another, Laura Bennett existed in neither, belonging entirely to the work. Room 304 was her first stop on the general medical floor. The door was slightly ajar, and she could hear the shallow breathing of Admiral Rashid before she even entered, could count the seconds between breaths like she was reading vital signs off a monitor. 78 years old. Stroke 3 weeks prior. Left-sided weakness that was improving marginally with each passing day, though no one said it aloud. Hope was a currency too expensive to trade on the morning shift. She knocked twice, softly, and pushed the door open. The Admiral lay propped on pillows, his silver hair against the white linen like brushstrokes on canvas. His eyes opened slowly, dark and alert despite the medication and the paralysis that still claimed half his face. Laura's hands moved to his vitals with the economy of motion that came from doing something 10,000 times before: BP cuff, pulse ox, temperature. Her movements were too practiced for a civilian nurse. Too precise. The kind of precision that came from field medicine, from knowing that hesitation cost lives, that every motion needed to matter. "Good morning, Admiral," she said, her voice quiet as the corridors outside. "How's the pain today?" "The same," he said, the word slightly slurred on his left side. "No better." "No worse." She nodded, logging the vitals in his chart. Her hands were steady, but there were scars visible on her forearms when she reached for the blood pressure cuff, thin white lines that could have been from a dozen things, from surgery or accident or age. They were not. They were from fragmentation. From shrapnel. From a mortar round in Ramadi that had changed everything. She pulled her sleeves down slightly as she worked, not conscious of doing it, muscle memory of concealment as automatic as breathing. When she adjusted his pillow, the dog tag slipped free from beneath her scrubs, the chain catching the pale light filtering through the hospital window. It dangled for just a moment, tarnished silver, name engraved but worn smooth from decades of contact. She tucked it back quickly, her fingers brushing it with a kind of tenderness reserved for the things that kept you alive. Admiral Rashid's eyes tracked the movement. He said nothing. Laura finished her checks and left him with the call button within reach, the routine as established and unchanging as gravity. The full line in his wrist was already in place, running normal saline, and she noted with satisfaction that there was no redness around the insertion site, no sign of infection. The line was clean. Professional. Placed with the kind of care that suggested someone who understood that infection could end a life as easily as bullets could. In the break room at 6:15 a.m., Laura poured coffee from the pot that had been brewing since the night shift started. The liquid was black as engine oil and twice as thick, the kind of coffee that could strip paint if you let it sit long enough. She was alone. The other nurses on the floor, Marcus, Jennifer, and 2 newer RNs fresh from their BSN programs, were finishing their notes in the charting area. When Laura entered the break room, there had been a fractional pause in their conversation. Nothing dramatic. Just a shift in the room's energy, like barometric pressure changing before a storm. By the time she poured her coffee, they had drifted back to their conversation, but it had moved to different topics. Nothing about patients. Nothing about medicine. Just surface talk, the kind designed to fill space and avoid depth. She didn't mind. She had learned that solitude was a gift, that noise was a weapon, that the quiet people got things done while the loud ones talked about getting things done. She drank her coffee standing at the window overlooking the parking lot, watching the city begin its day. Philadelphia was waking up, cars pulling onto streets, streetlights beginning their slow fade, the world transitioning from night to morning with the same gentle inevitability that marked every shift change. At 6:48 a.m., Dr. Caldwell arrived for rounds. He was a man built of confidence and tailored suits, his hair silver and his jawline the kind that could cut glass. He moved through Sacred Heart like he owned it, because in many ways, he did. Chief of surgery for the past 9 years. Board member. Connected to people with money and power, the kind of people who donated wings to hospitals and expected their names on plaques in perpetuity. He carried himself with the presence that made the air pressure change when he entered a room. The residents scattered before him like startled birds. The attending physicians deferred. Even the older nurses, the ones with 20 years of experience and the kind of authority that came from having seen everything, stood a little straighter when Caldwell approached. Laura did not stand straighter. She did not scatter. She continued reviewing medication orders at the nursing station, her eyes tracking dosages with the kind of focused attention that suggested she was not aware of his approach. She was entirely aware. She had developed a sense for threat the way animals develop a sense for weather. Caldwell's rounds began in room 301. She could hear his voice from where she sat, clipped and authoritative, the vocal equivalent of a surgeon's precision. He asked questions that didn't invite answers, made statements that didn't invite contradiction. By the time he reached room 304, she had reviewed for medication orders and flagged one for verification. It was not Caldwell's order. He wrote his prescriptions with the confidence of someone who had never made a mistake, or more precisely, who had made mistakes and had enough institutional power that they disappeared before anyone noticed. What Caldwell did notice, as he conducted his examination of Admiral Rashid, was the way the elderly man's eyes tracked toward the doorway when Laura passed in the corridor outside. He noticed the slight elevation in the Admiral's blood pressure when she appeared on the monitor, a small detail, barely clinically significant, but present nonetheless. He noticed the way her hands moved when she placed an IV line in another patient on the floor at 7:03 a.m., the precision of her movements, the economy of motion that suggested either natural talent or trained muscle memory. Probably natural talent, he decided. The kind of thing some people were simply born with. He did not consider the possibility that it was something else entirely. By 7:45 a.m., Laura had flagged the medication error for verification. It was a simple mistake, a decimal point in the wrong place on a beta-blocker order. Small enough that it could have been missed. Small enough that if it had been missed, it could have killed a patient. She waited until Caldwell was free, until he had completed his rounds and was dictating notes in the resident lounge, before she approached him. "Dr. Caldwell," she said, her voice quiet, deferential. "I wanted to verify an order from this morning." He looked up from his dictation, his expression already cooling into something clinical and dismissive. "Yes?" "The metoprolol order for room 307. The dose appears to be written as 250 milligrams. The usual starting dose is 25 to 50. There was a silence. Long enough that she could hear the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, that faint electrical hum that never quite stopped, that was always there beneath everything else in a hospital, like the sound of the building breathing. Caldwell's jaw tightened. "I'm aware of standard dosing protocols, Nurse Bennett," he said, his voice dropping slightly in pitch, the vocal equivalent of a threat made visible. The decimal point was intentional. The patient's cardiac history requires. The patient's most recent chart shows no indication of cardiac history beyond mild atrial fibrillation, Laura said. She did not interrupt him. She simply spoke, her voice steady as a surgical laser. "His ejection fraction is 55%. Normal range. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. In that silence, Caldwell's eyes narrowed. In that silence, something shifted. "Thank you for your concern, Nurse Bennett," he said finally, his tone suggesting that her concern was the last thing he valued. "The order stands as written." He returned his attention to his dictation, dismissing her. Laura stood there for a moment longer, just long enough to suggest that she was not obeying him, but rather choosing her moment of departure, and then she left. She could feel his eyes on her back as she walked away. She could feel the weight of his attention, the beginning of something she had hoped to avoid by keeping her head down, by being quiet, by being just a nurse. But that wasn't the thing about being quiet. The quiet people saw everything. And when they spoke, people listened, even if they didn't want to. The quiet people saw everything. And when they spoke, people listened, even if they didn't want to. Laura Bennett had learned this truth 3 years ago, the first day she'd pinned her scrubs over the scar tissue that mapped her body like a battlefield atlas. She moved through Sacred Heart Hospital with the precise efficiency of someone who had once triaged mass casualties in a combat zone, her hand steady, her voice measured, her presence the kind that made families trust her even when doctors frightened them. But competence, she was learning, could be a threat to men like Dr. Caldwell, men whose power depended on hierarchy remaining unquestioned, on the chain of command never bending under the weight of evidence. Room 218 smelled like antiseptic and fear. Mrs. Patterson lay in the bed, her family gathered like sentinels, 2 adult daughters and a son, their faces creased with worry over her post-operative pain management. Laura was checking the 4 line when she noticed it immediately, the morphine drip running at 4 mg per hour for a 68 kg patient with a creatinine clearance of 32, stage 3 renal disease. The dosage was incorrect, accumulated metabolites waiting to suppress respiratory drive, a slow suffocation disguised as palliative care. She'd seen this error pattern before. It came from scripts that didn't adjust for kidney function, from physicians who trusted the EMR defaults more than they trusted math. Dr. Caldwell arrived for rounds at 10:11 a.m., his white coat perfectly pressed, his posture carrying the kind of authority that filled rooms like pressure changes before a storm. Laura approached him outside the door, her voice low and deferential, the way she'd learned to speak to surgeons. "Dr. Caldwell, the dosage on the morphine drip is incorrect for Mrs. Patterson's weight and renal function. At current rates, she'll accumulate active metabolites within 48 hours. His face hardened. The change was minute, a tightening around the eyes, a slight flattening of the mouth, but Laura had spent enough time reading danger to recognize it instantly. He turned toward the family with a smile that could have frozen blood. "Folks, this is what happens when nurses think they're doctors." Then he faced Laura, and his voice took on the tone of someone explaining basic concepts to a child. "Your job is to follow orders, not question them, Miss Bennett. Perhaps you've forgotten your place." The patient's son shifted. His eyes moved between them like a man watching a tennis match he didn't understand. Laura took one measured breath. The tears were already forming, not from shame, but from the exhaustion of being small in rooms where she'd once carried lives in her hands. She didn't let them fall. "Not yet. I've triaged mass casualties in Ramadi, doctor. I think I can handle basic pharmacology." One tear escaped anyway, running down her left cheekbone like a mistake. She wiped it without breaking eye contact. Her gaze held his for exactly 3 seconds, long enough for him to see that she hadn't flinched, hadn't looked away, hadn't crumbled. It was the composure of someone who had stood in a medical tent with mortars landing outside, deciding who would live and who would die with the same clinical precision she'd just applied to his medication order. Caldwell's jaw clenched visibly. A muscle worked beneath his left ear. "My office. Now." He reduced the dosage by 50% once she left. Laura heard about it from Tom, the veteran ICU nurse, who also happened to watch everything. But by then, Caldwell's response was already in motion, a coordinated campaign executed with the precision of someone who understood institutional power the way generals understand terrain. The next morning, the unit board displayed its verdict. The handwriting was Caldwell's, the formatting official, the accusations carefully constructed to sound procedural rather than vindictive. Nurse L. Bennett, uniform violation, unauthorized jewelry, insubordination, questioning attending physician, failure to follow chain of command. 3 nurses read it as they arrived for shift change, their eyes sliding toward Laura like she'd announced an illness. She read it once, her face absolutely still, and continued to her assignment. The dog tag beneath her scrubs felt heavier, pressed against her sternum like an anchor to a life she'd supposedly left behind. The isolation began subtly, the way institutional cruelty always does. Sarah, her closest ally on the trauma unit, a woman who'd worked beside her for 2 years, who understood without words what Laura carried, was reassigned to night shift the following day. Then Tom disappeared to the pediatric unit. Within 14 days, every nurse who'd spoken to her in the break room was scattered across different rotations, different wings, different time zones of the hospital schedule. They didn't have a choice. Caldwell had moved them like chess pieces, and the board had moved them because he had the authority to do so. Laura had watched enough institutional games to know that resistance made everything worse. The break room had fluorescent lights that buzzed like failing nerve endings. At 1:03 p.m. on a Wednesday, Laura entered with her lunch, turkey sandwich, an apple, black coffee that tasted like the hospital's complete indifference to flavor. 6 nurses sat at the center table in animated conversation, the kind of casual bonding that happened when people felt safe with each other. The moment her chair scraped back from the adjacent table, they moved. Not dramatically. Not with announcement. They gathered their food in unison, a choreography so practiced it might have been rehearsed, and relocated to the far corner near the vending machines, resuming their discussion in lowered voices that made it clear the topic had changed. Laura unwrapped her sandwich. The bread was slightly stale. She took one measured breath and ate alone beneath the fluorescent lights that hissed like pressurized air escaping. She did this every day for 2 weeks. The nurses never stopped leaving. Their departures became the heartbeat of her day, punctual as monitors, predictable as the medication schedule she still followed perfectly, even though the hospital had begun treating her like a contaminated instrument. Then came room 187, where an elderly man named Kowalski was failing in the way old bodies do when the organs simply decide they're finished with the work. His 3 adult children kept vigil, a daughter on each side of the bed and a son standing at the foot, their faces carrying the particular exhaustion of people watching someone they loved slip away in increments. Laura was adjusting his oxygen when Caldwell entered for rounds, his presence announcing itself before his voice did. Nurse Bennett was just overstepping her training again, he said loudly, the comment directed at the residents trailing behind him like remoras. Trying to adjust palliative protocols without consulting the attending. Laura's hand paused on the oxygen valve. Her voice remained professional, the voice of someone following protocols. I was following the pain management protocol you signed off on yesterday, Doctor. One of Kowalski's daughters, the middle one with her father's eyes, looked between them with the expression of someone watching a crime unfold in slow motion. Caldwell stepped closer, close enough that Laura could smell his cologne, the kind of proximity designed to establish dominance. Are you contradicting me in front of a patient's family, Nurse Bennett? The tears were already forming. She could feel them gathering behind her eyes like storm fronts. But her voice remained devastatingly calm, each word a burnished stone. I've held dying soldiers in the dirt and promised their mothers I did everything possible. I won't do less for Mr. Kowalski. The tear that escaped was inevitable, the kind that comes from somewhere deeper than emotion, from the marrow of exhaustion, from 3 years of erasure, from the weight of a dog tag hidden beneath her scrubs. She wiped it without looking away. Her composure never fractured. Her voice never wavered. She simply stood there, a woman holding a dying man's oxygen line, tears running down her face, looking at Caldwell with the quiet certainty of someone who had already survived the worst the world could do. He wrote another formal complaint on his tablet before he left, his stylus pressing into the screen with enough force that Laura could hear the impact across the room. That evening, she found her schedule changed. The posting on the unit board showed her reassigned to the least desirable rotation, 3 p.m. to 11 p.m. on the general medical floor, stripped of ICU access pending administrative review of clinical competence. The ban was official now, documented, protected by the hospital's institutional machinery. But that wasn't the worst part. The ban was official now, documented, protected by the hospital's institutional machinery. But that wasn't the worst part. 2 days into her suspension, Laura sat at her kitchen table with her coffee going cold, watching the rain streak the Philadelphia windows. Her apartment was quiet in a way that felt dangerous, too much time to think, too much time for her instincts to scream that something was coming. The papers HR had delivered that morning were still in their manila envelope, the language precise and clinical, pending investigation into credentials and scope violations. Caldwell had been thorough. Methodical. She recognized the pattern from remedy, identify the threat, isolate it, neutralize it systematically. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She let it ring twice before answering. Laura, it's Sarah. Don't call me back on this line. Sarah's voice was tight, the kind of tight that comes from looking over your shoulder. Laura's former ally. One of the nurses Caldwell had reassigned to nights 3 weeks ago. Something's wrong. Something's very wrong. Laura straightened. Tell me. Caldwell scheduled a mandatory training session for the entire code team tonight. 7 p.m. sharp. All 12 members. Emergency response protocols, that's what the email said. Sarah's breath came fast now. Laura, that's never happened. Never. We don't pull the entire code team at once. Never. The rain hammered harder against the window. Laura's combat instincts, the part of her that had triaged mass casualties in remedy, the part that had learned to read tactical patterns in chaos, that part woke up fully now. Who's scheduled to be high risk tonight? 3 patients on the ICU floor. Admiral Rashid in 304, post-stroke recovery. 2 post-surgical patients in 301 and 306. Laura, Rashid's been having minor arrhythmias all week. Nothing serious yet, but... When does the training start? 7. Sharp. And there's more. Sarah's voice dropped. Tom called me from administration. Caldwell also filed an ICU access restriction through some administrative override. He's saying you need supervisor clearance for every level now. Even badge access is locked. Tom said he tried to swipe in 5 minutes ago and got a security alert. Laura's hands went still. The sound of the rain became the only real thing in the room. Caldwell wasn't just removing her from cases. He was geometrically blocking her from the entire critical care floor. He was doing something surgically precise. Laura? Are you there? I'm here. Thank you for calling. She hung up and stared at the date on her phone, 6:18 p.m. She had 42 minutes to drive to Sacred Heart. She had 42 minutes to decide if walking back into that hospital while suspended would be professional suicide or something else entirely. She grabbed her keys. The visitor lot at Sacred Heart was half full, the evening shift still running its machinery. Laura parked in the back corner and sat with the engine off, watching the glass doors of the main entrance. At 6:06 p.m., she saw them filing in. The code team. All 12 of them, moving with the confused shuffle of staff who'd been summoned to something they didn't understand. Dr. Caldwell stood near the conference room, checking his watch with the precision of someone running a carefully timed operation. Laura waited until 6:52 p.m., then walked through the visitor entrance. Her visitor badge from 6 months ago, the one they'd never collected back, was still in her scrub pocket. She clipped it on as she passed through the lobby, keeping her face neutral, her pace steady. Just another visitor. Nobody questioned her. The hallway to the ICU was exactly as quiet as Caldwell had planned it to be. The normal afternoon staff had gone home. The evening shift had been pulled to the training. The ICU floor hung in a kind of suspended silence, the kind that happens when a hospital's arteries stop flowing blood. Fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song. A ventilator wheezed somewhere distant. At 7:03 p.m., the code alarm sounded from room 304. Not a soft alarm. A full cardiac arrest alert. The kind that should have sent 12 people running. The kind that echoed through empty hallways and found no answer. Laura moved. She didn't think. She didn't hesitate. Her body remembered what her suspended credentials said she was no longer allowed to do. She ran toward room 304, her shoes snapping against the tile floor with each stride, and through the window she saw him, Admiral Rashid, 72 years old, post-stroke, now flatlined on a monitor that beeped its death song into a room with no one to hear it. The door to room 304 was unlocked. Laura was inside in 2 seconds. Admiral Rashid. Admiral. She checked his carotid pulse. Nothing. His skin was already cooling, already that particular gray that comes when the heart stops pumping oxygen through the brain. The monitor showed asystole, a straight, flat line, the sound of clinical death. His central line port was accessible. The crash cart was 6 feet away. The defibrillator pads were still in their wrapper. The for access was already established from his stroke admission. She grabbed the crash cart and pulled it to his bedside. In trauma, you have minutes. In cardiac arrest, you have moments. She'd learned the mathematics of dying in a field hospital where the only answer to most equations was that people didn't make it. But this one had a chance if someone was fast enough. Laura's hands moved on their own, muscle memory and combat training colliding with hospital protocol. She pushed 1 milligram of epinephrine for and watched the monitor. The line remained flat. She pushed another dose. Still nothing. The clock in her head was counting down. 3 minutes was the standard for neurological death, but in her experience, the real window was tighter. 5 minutes for permanent brain damage. Maybe 6 if you were lucky. She checked his airway. She positioned his head. She moved with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who had done this intense without electricity, in desert dust that filled every breath, under fire with shells landing close enough to shake the ground. The crash cart's monitor beeped once. Twice. Then a blip. A single electrical impulse, barely visible on the screen. "Come on," Laura whispered, and pushed another dose. The rhythm started to organize. Not normal. Not safe. But organized. The body's electrical system flickering back to life like a flame trying to kindle from smoking embers. She checked his pulse again. Weak. Thready. But there. His blood pressure, when she checked the cuff, read 54/32 and climbing. Barely perfusing, but climbing. The door to room 304 opened. Dr. Caldwell stood in the frame, his expression a perfect mask of concern and shock. Behind him, Laura heard footsteps, security. Fast. Coming. "Nurse Bennett, you're not authorized to be here. You violated the suspension order. Security is en route to escort you from the building." Laura didn't look at him. She was already placing the oxygen mask over the Admiral's face, already checking the 4 line again, already running through the mental checklist of what came next. The ventilator. The heart monitor. The blood work. The imaging to figure out why a recovering stroke patient's heart had suddenly decided to stop. "He was in full arrest," she said quietly. Her voice was level. Clinical. The voice of someone stating facts. Room was empty. No one in the ICU. "Your training session started at 7 p.m. He coded at 7:03. For minutes of no resuscitation. "That's not your concern," Caldwell said. "You're suspended. You have no authority here." Laura finally looked at him. In her eyes was something that had been forged in Ramadi, tested under circumstances that most human beings never had to endure. Not anger. Not fear. Just clarity. He's stable now. Blood pressure climbing. Sinus rhythm establishing. She was already moving to the monitor, adjusting the oxygen flow rate. "You need to notify ICU attending. You need to order a stat EKG. You need imaging to determine what caused the arrest. She said each thing with the quiet authority of someone who had run trauma codes where the only thing between the patient and death was precise execution of steps. And you need to call a cardiologist. Caldwell's face was going white. He understood, in that moment, what she had done. But he also understood something else, that a nurse suspended for unauthorized practice had just performed emergency resuscitation without authorization, and the camera in the corner of the room had recorded every second of it. The security guards were in the doorway now. One of them was reaching for her arm. But that wasn't the worst part. At 7:07 p.m., a text came through to the hospital's administrative phone. A text that had been sent by someone who'd been monitoring Sacred Heart surveillance system from a secure satellite office 2 miles away. A text that said, Code Blue, Room 304. Admiral Rashid unresponsive. Recommend immediate review of ICU floor staffing during 19 to 19:05 window. The text came from Naval Intelligence. It came from an office that had been watching this hospital, and this specific patient, for the last 4 days. It came from people who knew exactly what they were looking at on that camera feed. People who recognized the movements, the precision, the training that no civilian nurse in Philadelphia had any reason to possess. And they knew exactly who had sent them there. The monitor alarm screamed at 6:19 p.m. Admiral Rashid's room sat empty. No nurses. No residents. No one. Laura stood at the nursing station reviewing charts when the flatline sound cut through the floor like a knife through silence. She moved before conscious thought could slow her down, muscle memory from Ramadi, from forward operating bases, from 1,000 moments when hesitation meant death. Her legs carried her to room 304 in 11 seconds flat. The Admiral lay motionless, his body a silhouette against the darkening window. Chest unmoving. No respiratory effort. His monitor showed the telltale pattern of catastrophic cardiac arrest. The electrical system had simply surrendered. Laura registered the empty hallway behind her. No code team response. No overhead announcement. No one coming. She understood in that frozen moment what Caldwell had engineered, mandatory training sessions scheduled for the entire cardiothoracic team during the precise window when a 73-year-old man recovering from a stroke would need them most. Sabotage wrapped in administrative necessity. Brilliant. Lethal. The crash cart sat beside the bed, positioned for routine monitoring. Laura's hands moved before her mind caught up. She grabbed the defibrillator pads and placed them on his bare chest. 200 joules. His body convulsed once, twice. The monitor kept its flat-line rhythm. Chest compressions began, her palms locked, her shoulders driving down at the rate of 110 compressions per minute. The rain outside picked up, hammering the window like a second heartbeat, like a rhythm trying to teach his chest how to work again. 30 compressions. Clear. 2 rescue breaths with the ambu bag. Another cycle. 2 minutes. His brain was dying. By 3 minutes, irreversible damage. By 4, he was gone. Laura released the defibrillator and stared at the surgical tray beside the bed, the one Caldwell had left there, a token gesture toward preparedness that was actually a death sentence. Scalpel. Betadine. Sutures. Everything needed. Everything impossible. She didn't think. Thinking was luxury she'd surrendered in Ramadi. Laura grabbed the scalpel. The cool metal felt like home in her palm. She swabbed his chest with betadine in a quick vertical line, her movements economical and precise, no hesitation, no doubt, just the automation of someone who'd done this in a tent with mortars falling outside. The blade entered his skin with the softest resistance. Blood welled immediately. She made the incision cleanly through skin and subcutaneous tissue, deep enough to reach the intercostal muscles between his ribs. The smell of antiseptic and iron filled the small room. 3 residents had frozen in the hallway window, their faces draining of color as they watched a nurse perform emergency thoracotomy, a procedure that existed only in trauma surgery, in military medicine, in the realm of people with nothing left to lose. Laura cracked his ribs with her hands, applying pressure to spread them apart. The sound was like breaking a branch, that small, definitive snap. Her scarred fingers reached into his open chest cavity, moving through the sterile field she'd created, and located his heart. Cold. Slack. Refusing to work. She began cardiac massage, direct compression of the organ itself, her fingers squeezing the ventricle in rhythmic pulses. Squeeze. Release. Squeeze. Release. The motion was hypnotic, meditative, a dance she performed on the floors of field hospitals and in the back of helicopters. "Someone page cardiothoracic," she said without looking up. Her voice was steady. Conversational. Like a woman checking inventory instead of running her hands through another human being's open chest. 20 seconds. The residents had scattered. One was already on the phone, another was prepping an OR transfer kit, a third was standing paralyzed by the window. The hallway was filling now. Word traveled fast. Nurses abandoning their stations. Doctors emerging from offices. The entire floor converging on room 304 to watch a suspended nurse saving an admiral's life without authorization, without credentials, without anything but the muscle memory of 100 battlefield surgeries. 40 seconds. Laura's hands moved with the precision of apex predators, graceful, efficient, utterly without mercy. She felt the heart shift beneath her fingers, felt the subtle change in resistance that meant the tissue was responding. At 53 seconds, his heart contracted on its own beneath her hands. The monitor beeped. Once. Then again. His pulse established itself, weak, irregular, but present. His blood oxygen levels climbing, 62. 74, 81. She maintained compression support, keeping the pressure on to ensure adequate circulation until the CT surgeon arrived 6 minutes later and took over at his bedside. Laura stepped back, her scrub soaked in blood, her hand steady as she stripped her gloves. The hallway had filled with staff, 20, 30 people, maybe more, all of them silent. All of them watching. The security footage would capture everything, the scalpel, the incision, the cracked ribs, the hand reaching into his chest. It would loop across the hospital system. By tomorrow morning, every person with credentials would have seen it. Caldwell pushed through the crowd, his phone already at his ear. "Security, I need Nurse Bennett removed from the building immediately," he said, his voice cutting through the silence like a scalpel. "I want her credentials revoked and a police report filed for assault and practicing medicine without a license." He looked directly at Laura, his eyes flat with the triumph of a man who'd just caught his enemy committing the exact violation he'd engineered. That was unauthorized surgery. That was assault on a patient. 2 security guards approached from the opposite end of the hallway. Laura didn't resist. There was nothing to resist. She'd known the moment she picked up that scalpel what the cost would be. She'd done it anyway. As the guards escorted her past the crowd of staff, nurses averted their eyes. Everyone except Sarah, the one ally Caldwell hadn't managed to isolate. Sarah's lips moved silently, "Thank you." Laura nodded once and walked out. The administrative conference room on the 4th floor smelled like stale coffee and the particular fierce sweat of bureaucrats protecting themselves. Caldwell sat across from the hospital's attorney, Patricia Reeves, and 2 board members he'd personally cultivated over 7 years of strategic donations and favors. The room's single window overlooked the city turning gray in the fading light. She performed a thoracotomy without authorization, without supervision, in direct violation of her suspension, Caldwell said, his voice carrying the reasonable tone of someone presenting mathematical truth. No civilian nurse has the right to open a patient's chest cavity. That's the definition of practicing medicine without a license. I want her terminated. I want her reported to the state medical board for investigation. He paused, letting the weight settle. And I want it documented that this violation occurred under my supervision, that I attempted to prevent it. Patricia Reeves, a woman whose hourly rate exceeded Laura's annual salary, nodded slowly. The documentation is straightforward. We'll initiate formal termination for violation of suspension and unauthorized medical practice. The state board notification is mandatory given the nature of the violation. She made a note. The Admiral's family will likely attempt to defend her, but the facts are clear. She was suspended. She performed surgery. Those facts don't change regardless of outcome. One of the board members, a surgeon named Henley, shifted in his seat. The patient's alive because of what she did. Doesn't that factor into? It factors into nothing, Caldwell interrupted smoothly. A good outcome doesn't justify the violation. In fact, it makes it worse. She's established a precedent that suspensions can be ignored if the nurse believes the outcome justifies the action. That opened Sacred Heart to massive liability. The only appropriate response is termination and full investigation. The other board member, a financier named Richardson, was already nodding in agreement. Caldwell had spent months establishing the narrative. These two represented no resistance. Caldwell had already won. That was the thing about power, it was like a virus. Once it infected the system, it spread through channels no one was looking at. The conference ended at 5:33 p.m. By 5:41 p.m., Laura was officially terminated from her position at Sacred Heart Hospital pending credential review and investigation by the Pennsylvania State Board of Nursing. The hospital sent her a security escort to collect her personal items from her locker. 3 years of nursing at Sacred Heart, 3 years of rebuilding herself, 3 years of proving she could be someone other than a soldier. Gone in 8 minutes. Laura stood in the parking lot in borrowed scrubs borrowed from security, her car keys in her hand, watching the rain begin to fall. She moved like someone walking underwater, each step deliberate, each breath a small negotiation with gravity. She drove on autopilot to Laurel Hill Cemetery on the far side of the city, the same cemetery where she'd stood 11,000 times before, in rain and snow and sunlight that felt like indictment. The rain fell harder as she knelt at Marcus Bennett's grave. The white marble headstone read, SSGT Marcus Bennett, USMC Scout Sniper, beloved husband, died Ramadi 2004. She traced his name with fingers that still smelled of betadine and blood. I tried to just save lives quietly, Marcus, she whispered. I thought if I kept my head down, stayed small, just helped people, I could build something new. But I failed again. The rain soaked through her jacket, cold and relentless. Just like I failed to save you. She sat in the mud beside his grave until the cemetery closed at 8, then drove home to her dark apartment and collapsed on the couch without turning on the lights. Outside her window, the city continued its indifferent rotation. Somewhere in the hospital, Caldwell was probably having dinner, savoring the victory. Somewhere, the Admiral was being stabilized in the ICU. Somewhere, a dozen residents were describing the extraordinary thing they'd witnessed to people who would tell 10 other people who would tell 10 more. By morning, Sacred Heart's background check on Laura Bennett triggered a system flag that made Sandra Young, the HR director, sit back in her office chair with a small intake of breath. The screen read, classified, security clearance required. Everything else was redacted. Entire sections of her military discharge paperwork replaced with black bars. Her service record inaccessible without TS/SCI clearance authorization. Her entire past locked behind federal encryption. Sandra Young had worked in hospital administration for 19 years and had never seen a personnel file like this. She called her supervisor immediately. The rain fell in sheets across Laurel Hill Cemetery, turning the marble headstones into mirrors of the gray sky above. Laura stood alone at the grave, her hand trembling as it traced the letters carved deep into white stone. Not trembling from cold. Not trembling from fear. The trembling was restraint, the kind that comes from holding everything together for 3 years and finally feeling the seams split. SSGT Marcus Bennett. Her husband's name. Marine dress blues folded in a shadow box at home. A wedding ring she still wore beneath her scrubs. 23 years old when a sniper round took him in the same fire base where she'd lost her leg. They'd been engaged for 4 days. I tried to just save lives quietly, Marcus, she whispered, her voice steady despite the tears. Rain hammered her face like accusation. I tried to be invisible. I thought that was the smart thing. That was the safe thing. She pressed her forehead against the cold stone. But I failed again. Caldwell knew exactly how to break someone trying to disappear. He knew we'd rather die than fight back. She stayed there until the rain turned her scrubs translucent, until her fingers went numb against the marble, until something inside her crystallized into certainty. Not anger. Certainty. She had survived Ramadi. She had survived the IED that shattered her femur and ended her deployments. She had survived 3 years of building a new identity as someone unremarkable, unmemorable, unthreatening. But survival wasn't living. And Marcus had always known that. The call came at 2:22 a.m. Sandra Young had worked in hospital administration for 19 years and had never seen a personnel file like the one that appeared in Sacred Heart's background check database. The system flagged it automatically, a red banner, then another, then a cascade of alerts that should have been impossible on a nursing file. Classified security clearance. Top secret SCI access. Pentagon verification required. A phone number that started with a 202 area code nobody called except from inside the Beltway. Sandra made one phone call at 3:15 a.m. 17 minutes later, her supervisor made another call. By dawn, the Federal Bureau of Investigation had opened a file on Sacred Heart Hospital itself, specifically on one Dr. James Caldwell and his recent investigation into a nurse named Laura Bennett. The Bureau did not move this fast for routine matters. The FBI moved this fast when national security protocols had been violated and a civilian institution had weaponized a federal background check against a protected individual. At 6:48 a.m., a black sedan pulled into Sacred Heart's employee parking lot. 2 agents in dark suits walked directly to Caldwell's office. He wasn't there. His phone records would later show he'd called his attorney at 4:33 a.m., booked a flight to Cabo at 5:12 a.m., and transferred $400,000 to an offshore account at 6:01 a.m. He was 2 minutes away from the airport departure terminal when Pennsylvania State Police pulled him over on I-76. The lobby of Sacred Heart Hospital filled with Navy dress uniforms by 9:16 a.m. They came without announcement, without warning, without the courtesy of administrative notification. 7 officers in dress whites with ribbons and medals stretching across their chests. A captain. 2 commanders. A master chief whose presence seemed to make the air pressure change. And Admiral James Rashid, wheeling himself through the automatic doors with a chest tube still taped to his ribs and eyes that had seen 47 years, half of them in military service. He positioned himself in the center of the lobby where every staff member moving through would have to acknowledge him. His voice cut through the ambient noise of monitors and overhead pages like a blade through silk. "This woman holds the rank of major," he announced, and his hand pointed directly at Laura as she emerged from the stairwell, still in her scrubs, still unaware of what had transpired in the 3 hours since she'd left Marcus's grave. Major Laura Bennett, United States Army Medical Corps. Retired. Combat medic. Surgical specialist. Battlefield operator. She is the reason I am standing here today, and you will treat her with the respect that rank demands. Laura's hands went cold. Not from shock. From recognition. From the moment her brain caught up to what her body already knew. The dog tag. The one she'd left behind on a broken chain during a medevac extraction from Forward Operating Base Shank in 2004. The one that had somehow made its way to a terrified 7-year-old boy she'd shielded with her own body during a mortar attack in the Jolon district. The boy who'd watched her disappear into a helicopter while his family lay bleeding in the rubble. The boy who'd kept that dog tag for 20 years. Kept it hidden. Kept it safe. Kept it as proof that someone had seen him when the world was collapsing. That boy was now an admiral. A hospital administrator appeared with a sealed manila envelope. Laura's hands moved on their own, opening it with the same mechanical precision that had guided her thoracotomy just hours earlier. Pages. Dozens of them. Her own service record, declassified and official, printed on government letterhead with signatures from the Pentagon. Her eyes moved down the list. Bronze Star for Valor under fire. The page blurred. Another Bronze Star for sustained medical operations. Her breath came out as a single word, no. Purple Heart for combat wound. Her femur. 17 surgeries to rebuild it. Another Purple Heart. That was 2. Purple Hearts meant you'd bled for your country twice, and Laura had done both times in the same year. Silver Star for Valor in Ramadi. For making triage decisions that saved a mass casualty situation when the only surgeon available was unconscious from blood loss. For operating on a table made of ammunition crates with nothing but a field kit and the calm certainty that giving up wasn't an option. Her voice dropped to a whisper. That was the school. The market bombing. The Master Chief stepped forward, his voice cutting through the lobby like a parade ground command. Silver Star for Valor under sustained fire in Ramadi. His hand moved. Navy Cross for actions that shielded civilian non-combatants during a hostile engagement. His eyes locked on hers. Combat Medical Badge with fur oak leaf clusters. For separate combat operations. For separate times you put your hands on a chest to keep the heart beating when everything else was trying to stop it. Laura's hands trembled. The trembling was restraint. The restraint was collapsing. The paper slipped from her fingers to the polished hospital floor. Admiral Rashid moved his wheelchair closer. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of 4 decades in uniform, of navigating the line between warrior and diplomat, of never forgetting the person who had given him his life back not once but twice. You were 7 years old, he said quietly. You watched me pick up my sister's hand from the street because it still had her wedding ring on it. You were 7, and the Americans were evacuating, and you thought your family was going to die. He paused. Breathed. You did die. That day. The boy who came out of that compound wasn't the same person who went in. He reached into his dress uniform jacket and withdrew a small object wrapped in green fabric. When he placed it in Laura's hand, the smell of brass and old metal filled the space between them. Her dog tag. Not tarnished. Polished. Maintained. Worn on a chain beside his own. 2 dog tags. 1 pair. One identity that had belonged to a major, and another that had saved a boy who would become her Admiral. I joined the Naval Academy because you showed me what service meant, Rashid said. I went through intelligence training because I needed to understand what my rescuer had been willing to do. I made it my mission to find you because you never stopped being a soldier, and soldiers don't leave their people behind. His voice hardened. So I'm not leaving you behind now. Not in a lobby. Not under suspension. Not erased by a man who thought he could destroy you with paperwork. The FBI liaison stepped forward, and with her came a folder so thick it could have been a textbook. She opened it with the efficiency of federal prosecutors who had spent the last 8 hours correlating financial records, surgical logs, device manufacturer communications, and witness statements into an airtight case. Dr. James Caldwell has accepted $847,000 in kickbacks from Meridian Surgical Systems in exchange for exclusive use of their devices in 57 surgeries at Sacred Heart Hospital, the liaison said, reading from a prepared statement designed to be quoted in every news outlet from Philadelphia to Washington. 6 of those surgeries resulted in documented patient complications directly attributable to the inferior quality of the devices he was being paid to use. She turned a page. He falsified surgical reports to conceal his role in those complications. 3 surgical nurses have come forward with testimony that Dr. Caldwell coerced them into silence using the same tactics he employed against Major Bennett: public humiliation, reassignment, isolation, and threats to their professional credentials. The Master Chief's jaw tightened. That was the moment Laura understood something that would reshape how she moved through the world for the rest of her career. Caldwell hadn't created the system of control that had silenced surgical nurses for decades. He'd just been very, very good at using it. The system itself was the predator. And systems, unlike individual men, were harder to fire. Federal prosecutors have charged Dr. Caldwell with wire fraud, healthcare fraud, and falsification of medical records, the liaison continued. His medical license has been suspended pending the outcome of the criminal trial. His malpractice insurance has been terminated. He is currently in federal custody. Laura didn't move. Didn't speak. The trembling had stopped. In its place came something colder, clearer, more permanent. The kind of calm that comes from understanding that you were never the problem. The system that allowed men like Caldwell to fester was the problem. And systems could be changed if you were willing to stay visible long enough to do it. That evening, as she left Sacred Heart for the first time in 24 hours, Sarah found her in the parking lot. Sarah and Tom both, because they'd been reinstated to their original shifts with full back pay and a formal apology from hospital administration. Sarah pulled her into a hug that felt like it could repair bone. "You're going to be okay," Sarah whispered. "More than okay. You're going to be extraordinary." 6 months later, Laura stood in a new office with her name on the door. Director of Trauma Services. A position created specifically for her, with a salary that acknowledged both her rank and her skills. Her credentials hung on the wall beside her commendations. The Silver Star. The Navy Cross. The Combat Medical Badge. Above them, in a shadow box lined with white silk, hung 2 dog tags on a chain, hers and the one returned by Admiral Rashid. Beside that frame sat a photograph of Marcus in his marine dress blues, taken 3 weeks before his death. He was smiling. He had always known what she was capable of. The first mass casualty incident came on a Tuesday in March. Multi-car pileup on IR-95 northbound, 12 patients, 3 in critical condition, ETA 8 minutes. Laura moved into the trauma bay with the calm precision of someone who had earned the right to lead through every trial that had tried to break her. She triaged in 8 minutes. She directed the response with a voice that no longer asked permission. She opened chests and repaired vessels and made decisions that meant some people lived and others died with dignity. Young residents who had once watched Caldwell humiliate her now moved at her direction without hesitation. Sarah worked beside her, and when a critical patient coded, Laura's hands moved with the same battlefield efficiency that had saved an admiral. The room went dead silent when the monitor showed sinus rhythm. That evening, in the same break room where nurses had once exiled her, Laura sat across from Admiral Rashid, who'd become a regular visitor to Sacred Heart. He volunteered now with veteran outreach programs, using his position to funnel resources to the wounded and forgotten that no administrator ever noticed. "Do you ever regret staying quiet?" he asked. Laura touched the dog tag beneath her scrubs. "I thought I had to hide to survive. Marcus always told me that real courage wasn't about the uniform. It was about showing up when someone needed you, regardless of the cost." She looked around the break room, now filled with staff who moved toward her, asked her advice, sought her mentorship. "I didn't fail, Admiral. I just needed to remember that saving lives was never about being invisible." She stood as a young nurse approached nervously, asking for guidance on a difficult central line placement. Walking the nurse through the technique with patient precision, the same way she'd done it under fire in Ramadi, the same way she'd done it in a hospital where everyone had finally understood who she really was. Heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrubs, saving lives in the dark. If this story moved you, subscribe for more tales of quiet heroes and systems finally held accountable. Comment below, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value? And share this with someone who needs to know that staying visible is sometimes the bravest thing you can do.